Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar today. We're going to be digging deeply into energy and renewable energy markets around the country. My name is Tim Carter. I'm president of Second Nature. Want to welcome everybody on the call. Before we get started, wanted to point out a couple things. One is that we do have a climate leadership summit coming up in February in Tempe. So those of you who haven't registered for that, please go to secondnature.org/2018 summit and you'll see the speakers and the agenda. Really excited. We have Paul Hawken as a keynote, who's really one of the leading voices on climate solutions, and has recently written a book called Project Drawdown. But today, so please do that. Today we're going to be talking about renewable energy delivered through competitive power markets, and this is a bit of a second phase of a conversation that we started a number of weeks ago with our friends at Open Road Renewables and Mike Volpe, who's a real expert in this area. You can go on to the next slide. And so they're one of our corporate partners. We do have a number of corporate partners that support things like our webinar series, but this is largely because as Second Nature staff, we have broad expertise in a variety of areas, but to get deep and to really drive solutions that we know campuses need, we need engaged technical assistance. And so Open Road's been a great recent addition to our portfolio of corporate sponsors. Next slide. And the summit, which we've talked about. Please come February 4th to 6th. We will have, I think we're running out of hotel rooms, so make sure you book your trip, and we'll engage in deeper conversations like the one we're about to have today. Okay, so digging in, this is I'm really excited about this webinar, mainly because I know very little about what we're about to talk about, and Mike knows a ton. And I think some of the questions that we get asked from campuses all across the country really could benefit from kind of a baseline level of knowledge, as well as a depth of knowledge about competitive wholesale power markets, and then how to do some or think through early stage evaluations of these different renewable energy options. So it's a really an interesting and compelling topic. I know I'm excited about this. It's worth mentioning that it is going to get detailed and very specific, and hopefully you'll be able to keep up all along the way. It's not meant to be, you don't need a PhD in any of this stuff, but it is going to be very specific to energy markets. And so don't get intimidated, and do ask questions. And so on the right side of the webinar panel, there's a questions tab. Feel free to fill those in. We'll have a period midway through between the first and second first section and second section where we'll have a chance to answer those questions. And then throughout, we're going to have a series of polling questions like we did last time with Mike. So please stay engaged there. We really like to hear feedback, and that actually helps shape how some of the future parts of the webinar go. And it helps us informs us about the next steps we'd want to take in this type of series, this highly technical series that we've been exploring. So part one is really Power Markets 101, but at a pretty deep, sophisticated level. And then part two is really digging into a case study where we're looking at, on the surface, maybe it looks like some clear economic answers for you as a campus, but the reality is, once you do some of the assessment in a deeper way, you may have some surprising solutions that aren't readily apparent. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. At the end, we're going to actually have a few next step options. One of which, if this feels too much to chew on just in a webinar series, and you have more questions you want to go into, we're happy to facilitate a follow-up call. And please do let us know if you're interested in that. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everybody. What we're going to talk about today is when you see a press release that says Google just signed up for 100 megawatts of wind energy from a project in the Panhandle to serve their data center load in Nebraska. How does that work? What do the economics look like? I know some campuses have looked at offsite renewable transactions, but the key driver here is cost savings or the opportunity for cost savings down the road, and then also greenhouse gas reduction goals. How this is structured, as Tim mentioned, we're going to talk about the way that electrons flow from a power plant to your facilities and the different market constructs, and then specifically competitive wholesale markets, how they enable campuses to have choice in where they buy their electricity from. So pretty simply, the first slide here is how do you buy your electricity? It's generated in a power plant, flows through high voltage transmission lines, step down to distribution lines, and delivered to your campus. However, there's two distinctions. If we want to go to the next slide here, the traditional model in the next slide is from a regulated utility, where the idea of a natural monopoly exists. We don't need redundant power lines. There's economies of scale in power generation delivery, and it makes sense for one system owner and operator to generate electricity, to transport it across the grid and deliver it to your campus. This is the model that exists ever since Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla had their War of the Currents, and really was the predominant model for power delivery to campuses through the mid-1990s. We'll go on to the next slide, but there's a different type of market as well, where customers have choice. And what they have choice in, we'll see here in the next slide, is choice in where they buy their electricity supply from. So they're not choosing which wires deliver electricity to the campus, but they're only choosing which generators they're buying the electricity from. The market has become pretty complex, and there's not a lot of transparency that if I select this retail supplier, that I'm getting it from this power plant. But as we peel the onion back here, we'll see that in competitive wholesale markets, you actually do have choice in where you buy your electricity from. So the background here is there was energy costs rising in the 70s and 80s, and free market economic theory was really prevalent at that time and took to the power sector. And companies like Enron and others work with legislators to say, hey, there is no incentive for the regulated utility to reduce their costs. And what we've seen is 5, 7, 10% year-over-year cost escalation on the electricity bills. What if we had competition where the power generators, the power plants, had to compete to sell their electrons based upon their economic merits? And customers had choice in who they bought their electricity from. This took place late 90s, early 2000s, and as we'll see in a few slides ahead from here, there are now 17 states where customers have choice. So why don't we go to the next slide?
What we wanted to do here was actually see on the audience side, before we got into the details, what the knowledge was. So this is the first poll. The question in the poll is, are you in a competitive wholesale market state or state with a vertically integrated utility? So A is competitive wholesale market state, B is vertically integrated utility, and C is I have no idea what you're talking about. So Devin, can you kick off that poll? Great. So majority know they're in a competitive market, or know that they're in a utility, but more people aren't sure than know if they're in a vertical utility. So that's kind of interesting. So great. This will be helpful, Mike. I think moving forward, you'll know that most of the folks here are in the markets you'll be talking about, and the ones that aren't sure or are in a vertically integrated utility, you'll be able to get a lot of this out of this too. So let's go back to the deck.
Yeah, and the next slide here, if we go to the next slide, it shows which states are in competitive wholesale markets. There are 17 states primarily focused in the Northeast, this middle of the country with ERCOT in Texas, Southwestern Power Pool in Oklahoma and on up to Kansas, MISO in the Midwest, and then California, the California Independent System Operator. So of the 3/4 of the folks that are on the line that know that they're in competitive wholesale markets and know that they have choice in how they buy their electricity, the next handful of slides are first going to focus on the supply side, how the competitive wholesale market works and how price formation takes place, and then on the demand side, how you as customers have choice. Let's go to the next slide. So what we see in this chart is something that's so foundational to the competitive wholesale markets and really to power generation at large. A similar phenomenon takes place within regulated utilities. But what we see here across the x-axis is cumulative power generation capacity for a system, and on the vertical axis, price per megawatt hour, which represents the marginal cost of power production. And this is a supply curve. The idea here is that as we want more supply to come online, the next most expensive power generator will come online. It's a concept known as economic dispatch. Let's go to the next slide. We see here for a given day at a given hour, we have 90,000 megawatts of demand on the system, and the system operator within the competitive market says, okay, we will keep dispatching generation until we get to a point where we have enough power plants that are online. The power plants provide the bid to say, hey, I can create power at $40 a megawatt hour. In this next situation, we see that the demand has increased from 90,000 megawatts to 150 because it's a hot summer day. Demand grows, and then that drives up the cost for the marketplace because less efficient turbines are coming online, different fuels. What we see is that different generators have different fuel sources and they have different costs of production. So this is a pretty foundational understanding of there's competition amongst generators. They compete based upon their marginal cost. And with that, as more load is shown in the marketplace, the next most expensive generator comes online. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. So this slide shows that as demand increases and decreases, really based upon heating and cooling load, lighting, things that you guys on your campus facilities know will drive the load profile of your facilities such that when it's hot and all the students are they're studying away, you're going to have more load than during the off-peak times. And as the demand goes up and down, the price in the marketplace will actually go up and down so much that over a 24-hour period, there could be a range of pricing of $20, $30, $40 a megawatt hour, or 2, 3, 4 cents a kilowatt hour. As the demand on the left chart moves horizontally and the price moves up and down, we're seeing the price on the right chart there. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's how the supply side of the equation works. You may not need to know all of that to make good energy procurement decisions, but to understand how off-site renewable transactions take place, it's important to understand how the wholesale market functions. And the fact is that you as a customer, as a campus, are actually buying electricity from the wholesale market through one of 3 different ways. Either through the distribution utility that owns the wires that provide the electricity to your campus, through a retail electric supplier or retail electric provider, or directly from the marketplace. So let's spend a minute and talk about each. When the power sector was deregulated and the supply side became competitive, all the wires that were in place, those utilities continued to provide what's called the standard offer service to you. If you're in Maryland, that could be Baltimore Gas and Electric. If you're in Ohio, that could be AEP Ohio. New York, it could be NGrid. You have one distribution utility, and that utility has the obligation to provide electricity supply to you if you choose to go the standard offer service route. I believe maybe 3/4 of all customers in competitive markets stick with the distribution utility. However, there's the opportunity to shop it and go to someone like Constellation or Direct Energy or Washington Gas, any retail supplier who will be providing the supply side of your electricity delivery. So you'll have the wires company, the utility that would provide the delivery component, and then you would have a retail supplier provide the supply side of it. Alternatively, if you have a large load and you're really sophisticated and interested in, let's say, cutting out the middleman, you could directly buy wholesale energy from the market, and you could do it either on an hourly basis, or you could buy a block of energy to hedge the exposure to forward costs, et cetera. So let's go to the next slide and show what the offerings look like from either a distribution utility or from a retail supplier. Okay, so what we have in the background here is the wholesale market that is showing pricing that has peaks and valleys based upon load increasing and decreasing. However, as a customer, the distribution utility or a retail electric supplier will offer you a fixed rate for your supply, 3.4 cents a kilowatt hour for 12 months for just the energy component. That would be the offering from either a distribution utility or a retail supplier. Oftentimes there are additional fees that are tacked on top of this, so folks are probably used to seeing 5, 6, 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And then in addition to the supply side, there is the delivery side, which has the cost for the distribution, the transmission distribution from the utility. Let's go to the next slide. Alternatively, there are plenty of folks out there that will buy electricity directly from the wholesale market. And the idea here is that by working with a retail supplier or the distribution utility, you're paying a bit of a premium for them to smooth out these fluctuations. But if you say over, a certain time frame, I'm okay with some variability in the supply cost, I prefer to buy a block of around-the-clock power and a block of on-peak power. And then if my campus uses less power than what I bought, then I will sell the excess back into the market. And if I'm short a little bit, then I will buy it from the market at the real-time price. That's an approach called block and index. There are folks out there like American PowerNet and Enernoc that have advised campuses on how to buy directly from the wholesale market. There's a construct called a sub-account that you would set up, and you would buy your power directly from the wholesale market. Within the wholesale market, you can either buy a forward block or you can buy it directly on the real-time index. Next slide, please. Okay, so for those, yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Oh, yeah. So we're going to do another poll. So we're currently wanting to understand how you are buying your electricity. Those of you, it doesn't really matter what situation you're in, whether you're in a regulated or not, but feel free to, now you have a little bit more background, fill in one of these 5 answers. You're in a regulated state, you're from a distribution utility, you're from a retail supplier, or you're doing directly from the wholesale market through whatever form, block and index or whatever you buy direct from the wholesale market. Or, as we will have on most of these, I have no idea. So we'll just take another maybe 5 or 6 seconds on this one. Interesting. So basically 2/3 are either straight from distribution utility or from a retail supplier. Very few are actually direct from wholesale. Some of you are still unsure, and then others are in that utility because you're in a regulated area. Great.
Well, let's move on to the next slide. So I think we're getting to a bit of the punchline here is that folks, or maybe half the punchline, folks are looking to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions through many different ways. The electricity supply is certainly one of them. And there's a handful of ways that you can do that through on-site combined heat and power, on-site renewables, purchase of green ERECs bundled with brown power supply, or purchase of the output of an off-site renewable project. Why don't we go on to the next slide? And I believe it's another polling question.
So let's just make some logical steps here. So now you know more about the market that you're in. We have an idea of what type of buying situation you have. There's a series of options relative to that power that you get that relate to greenhouse gas reductions. So we haven't even really talked about that as part of the utility mix or the supplier mix, but now we're shifting into this, like, what does this mean for us as campuses that have carbon neutrality goals or greenhouse gas reduction goals? So given those options, what are the ones that you're thinking about as a campus to reduce those GHG goals, including, on-campus conservation or energy efficiency? So about a third of you looking off-site, 22%, 1 in 5 are doing RECs, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the other 3 options are really on-site, different types of on-site options, with about a third doing efficiency or conservation.
Yeah, let's go on to the next slide. One thing that we're seeing on the corporate side, which I think is really transferable to the campus side, is that folks are moving away from REC procurement to fulfill their greenhouse gas reduction goals because of the additionality interest. And that is really where offsite renewables come in, is that there's a look beyond RECs. We want to have the opportunity for bulk greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We want to do it through our power supply, but we want our actions and our commitment to actually result in an additional project coming online. So maybe we go to the next slide here, which I think is a polling question to see if folks on the line, their GHG reduction goals have an additionality requirement.
And maybe as we bring that up, Mike, just to be clear, because people who bought RECs may have been doing it for a while and they haven't even thought about another alternative. So when you're saying additionality, you mean when you're purchasing RECs, you're not really driving a new project. You're buying those RECs off of an existing project. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and on the project development and finance side, once a project's online, it could be online for 5 years, and then it's still generating environmental attributes. But if it's selling those after the fact, that was not really the forcing function for that new renewable project to come online. Whereas an off-site project that has a power purchase agreement with a campus, that would be the forcing function, and that's what we've seen on the corporate side.
Yeah. So that's the intent behind this question, is that's what additionality is, what we're referring to here. So answers. So most don't, a third do, and maybe this is where the corporate side might be leading. Higher ed, I know we have mixed conversations with folks. Some people have been cranking out purchases of RECs for a long time and they don't think about additionality, and some, that's absolutely the criteria they use to decide whether or not a REC purchase will go forward. So good to know. Most people on here would say no.
Yeah, Tim, and it may actually be that a lot of the campuses made commitments before the corporates, and it's sort of the topic du jour on the corporate side now. So it may just be a product of early movers on the campus side, and at the time, offsite renewables were not cost effective enough to consider purchasing directly from them. But it's really been the cost improvements that provide some nice economic opportunities. Well, let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, here we go. So we're going to talk about how offsite renewables are delivered through the wholesale market. And if we thought about the previous slides, we talked about whether you're buying from the utility or retail supplier or a block and index. At the end of the day, you are buying your supply from the wholesale market. there may just be an aggregator in the middle who's providing a fixed price product. So taking the concept of the block and index where you buy power directly from the wholesale market, there is the opportunity to buy a around-the-clock block from the market for your needs in the middle of the night when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, and then an on-peak block from an off-site renewable project. And what this chart here shows, this is what a off-site solar project paired with an around-the-clock block would look like, where the campus commits to buying a certain amount of the output of a solar project, and through the wholesale market, that is delivered to their account as energy to serve their load. And then they also have an around-the-clock block. And if there's a mismatch between the load and the solar production, then that would settle at whatever the market rate is at that time. The opportunity here is, if you're familiar with the block and index approach, an off-site renewable transaction is just like bringing on a renewable block, where the block would be the solar production profile or the wind production profile. Let's go to the next slide. Alternatively, if you're a customer that says, well, that's a little bit of a bridge too far, I like the fixed price nature of how I've been buying electricity, I'd like to continue doing that. Retail electric suppliers like Constellation, Washington Gas Direct are developing products where they will deliver an off-site renewable project to your account and then have a fixed price nature to it. This is something that's pretty innovative. It's been developing over the last handful of years, and I know that they're really pursuing it in full force. So that's sort of a nice hybrid approach where you're still receiving the electricity from the offsite project, but you're receiving a fixed price supply contract. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the nuances with an offsite renewable project that's either a positive or a negative, depends who you ask, is that in order for a project to move forward, it needs to have a power purchase agreement of at least 15 years in length with the campus. Some instances, maybe 12, but generally 15 to 20 years is the time frame. So if you signed up for a certain amount of your supply at a time when the market's low and you think that the market's going to rise in the future, then that could be seen as a good transaction. What we see here is that the offsite renewable supply continues to cost the same price over this time frame, but in a situation where the wholesale market increases, when you go to re-up your retail power supply cost, that price would increase because the market has risen, whereas the offsite renewable supply would stay the same. Let's go to the next slide. Conversely, if you sign up your renewable supply at a time where the market then softens, as seen here, then you could be buying your renewable supply at a price that is out of the market. And that would be something that you would say, well, shoot, I didn't get that one right. So there's some strategies around how to protect yourself against this. But it should be known that one of the main areas that renewables, offsite renewables, have shown opportunity is as a hedge against rising electricity costs. Right now, in most markets, renewables are at about par with brown power supply. So if you say, well, it's more likely over the next 10 or 15 years that power prices will go up than they'll go down, and I'd be interested in bringing a third, half of my supply from a project, and it helps me with my greenhouse gas reduction goals, it's certainly an opportunity. Let's go to the next slide here. So we're wrapping up part one of how campuses and wholesale markets can buy off-site renewable energy through the competitive wholesale markets. I think this is an opportunity to maybe take some questions. Tim, do you want to share how questions should be submitted?
Yeah, we talked at the beginning. There's a question tab on the right side and of the webinar, GoToWebinar block. So feel free to send any into there.
Yeah, while folks are putting their questions together, Part two is going to be a deep dive into the economics with the understanding of how these constructs work. The real opportunity here is to come up with a renewable procurement strategy or an electricity supply procurement strategy that allows you to achieve your goals in a manner that's not putting undue exposure or risk onto your organization, but that there's a tremendous opportunity for a project 20 miles away from your campus where there's an educational component, it can be branded, there's local economic development benefits, and we are sort of focusing on the economic merits, but there's a lot more that comes with a large offsite renewable project that can be weaved into the curriculum and provide a lot of benefits to campuses.
Like, I'm trying to distill down the takeaways, and we've got now a situation where these wholesale markets exist, these competitive markets exist. Some campuses take advantage of them, some don't. Maybe 10 years ago when you made your commitment, you started on a REC purchasing plan, and I know we've seen that even on our neutrality campuses. Many of them do significant REC purchases to get to neutrality. But the opportunity here is delivery of this power in a variety of ways, whether this use the block approach with renewables, and it might be time for folks to explore that. Do you see any resistance that if you're going from your utility now or your current situation now to a change like this, are you going to come up, where do you see the resistance points from the supplier side or the utility side if you're looking to make a change?
That's a great question. So generally power supply contracts are 12, 18, 24 months in tenor. So one thing you have to look at is how long forward am I receiving my electricity supply? The other side of that is that renewable projects take quite a while to come online from when they're contracted to when they achieve commercial operation date. So generally, if it's 18 months out or longer, there's no problem with that. In terms of changing the supply approach, if you're in a retail state or a competitive choice state, there's no real resistance to that. It really hinges on the economic analysis to look at, I previously was buying my power supply every 12 months from my distribution utility or from a retail supplier. I'm now going to lock in a third of my power supply for the next 15 years from this offsite wind or solar project. And what approvals internally do I need to get to be able to commit to power supply for this tenor, as it's just a non-traditional way of thinking about it. The converse to that, and let me just put this plug in, people say, well, shoot, I can't go out 15 years and lock in my electricity prices, but we are naturally short on energy because our facilities have a useful life of 30, 40, 50, 100 years, maybe longer at a campus. So we know we're going to have energy needs, and we know the facilities are going to be there, and we know there's going to be students, but we don't have a procurement strategy in place that looks beyond generally 2 years forward. So it's a little bit of a mindset of this is a hedge against rising electricity costs. It's a good idea to have a certain amount of my supply come from a fixed price renewable. And oh, by the way, I do a lot of good on the GHG reduction side and from the opportunity for a local project to provide educational benefits.
So real quickly before we move on, there's one question about scale. Number of campuses are potentially too small to have enough demand to do a utility scale offsite project. So how do they overcome that? Do they need to work together, or is there some other strategy they could do on their own to have purchasing power for these utility size projects?
That's a great question. Thanks to whoever submitted that. I think there's two answers there. One is it's very, very common to see campuses work together to aggregate their load, but then the financial responsibility is not commingled. So maybe said another way, let's say there's 5 small campuses that together would have enough load for a 20 megawatt project. That project could sign 5 independent power purchase agreements, and 20% of the project output would be delivered to each of the 5 different campus accounts. That's no problem from the project side. So there's certainly a solution out there, and we love the idea of folks working together. And I think there's some purchasing power benefits where you're not taking any additional exposure as the customer, and you could only be maybe contracting with the most cost-effective project in the region. The other idea is we've seen a lot of community solar type programs pop up in states like New York, Maryland, Minnesota. And the idea is these are not, 50, 100 megawatt utility scale projects, but these are 2 to 5, maybe even 10 megawatt projects that connect to the distribution circuit. And they're established either through legislation or through regulation. And I would look at both of those if you're interested in offsite renewables to support your GHG reduction goals.
So in the one case, you're aggregating with others. In the other case, there's already this community project that's done that you would help support. And there are other people or entities in your area that were also supporting that same project. You're doing a kind of smaller slices of that 5 or 10 megawatt. So in that case, you wouldn't really need to create an aggregation in advance.
That sounds right. Yeah, just caveat that the community solar project may not even be built, but generally the commitment comes prior to construction, and it's the commitment by the university that enables the project to go forward.
Yeah. So you have additionality there. Okay, great. Let's keep going. I know we don't want to run out of time here. Let's go to the next slide.
Great. All right. So now we're going to get into the part that is laden with statistics and economics. And this is a representative case study. As Tim mentioned at the beginning, this is the type of work that would be done as you roll up your sleeves. And folks in the development community like myself, or advisors like Customer First Renewables, who's also a Second Nature partner, do this type of work. And it's all based upon publicly available information, but there's tools that have been built and there's some methodology. So you hear a story, you are a university in Virginia, and you hear a story of a $18 wind PPA being signed in Texas. You say, man, that sounds really good. I think the best PPA, power purchase agreement, that we can do in Virginia is a $37 solar PPA. Does it make more sense to do the $18 PPA where I'm buying wind in Texas, or the $37 PPA from a solar project in Virginia? Next slide, please. So the opportunity to look outside of your market, if you're in Virginia, to say, maybe I should look at Texas, is driven on this wholesale market idea that these markets all have a economic dispatch curve, and natural gas is the fuel for the majority of the dispatch hours. So the idea is, and if we go to the next slide here, if natural gas price rises in one market, it will rise in another market. And if the idea is that I'm doing this offsite renewable transaction to hedge against rising electricity prices, well, if I'm in Virginia and I'm exposed to rising electricity prices, then it's probably such that if electricity prices rise in Virginia, then they will also rise in Texas. Let's go to the next slide. You look back at the movement of ERCOT West Zone, which is in the red, versus Dominion Zone in Virginia, and this sort of holds with that view that over time, as natural gas prices rise and fall, so too does the electricity wholesale market in Texas, as it does in Virginia and Dominion territory. Next slide, please. So the concept of the highest value project has been created, where, again, we're a campus in Virginia or Maryland or Pennsylvania, and the pricing of renewables, because we don't have as robust of a wind resource in that region as we do down in Texas, is more expensive. So with wind economics being more competitive, if we're a campus on the East Coast, we may look to Texas for renewable procurements. Let's go to the next slide. This is what a lot of corporates have done really from 2000 maybe to 2010 to 2015. But as we'll see with this approach, there is some risk that you're exposed to. And the economic analysis of which offsite project makes the most sense requires a multi-layered approach. Next slide. So this builds on this highest value concept, where if you look at the prevailing energy price in a region versus the cost of renewables, it would say that certain areas create a higher value project than others. If we go to the next slide, please, we'll see specific numbers being shown in how this approach looks at. So highest value concept is a ERCOT wind project. The trailing 3-year value of energy in the market is $22, and the PPA price, the power purchase agreement price for the wind, is $18, versus the trailing 3-year value of wholesale energy in Virginia is $33 versus a $37 PPA price. Therefore, based upon this comparison, it appears though, even if you're a university in Virginia, you should look to Texas wind for the most economic transaction. Let's go to the next slide. To enhance the methodology, production profile weighting was done to the wholesale energy values, where if you look at the production profile weighted value of energy in ERCOT when the wind blows versus when the sun shines in Virginia, you see that it's not quite as clear that the wind project in ERCOT is more competitive, but it still appears to be the most competitive. Let's go to the next slide.
So, Mike, just real quickly, when you say production profile weighting, you're talking about explain that term.
The hours that the wind or solar project is producing, it earns that value of energy in the market. And because the value of energy in the market changes hour by hour, energy in the middle of the day on a hot summer day has more value than it does in the middle of the night when the weather's moderate.
Yep.
So in order to enhance the understanding of the value of an offsite project, you have to think about what energy are you replacing with the offsite renewable that you would otherwise buy from the market or buy from a retail supplier.
Yep, got it.
So this is a really interesting takeaway, and this is where a handful of folks have, wished that they hadn't gone for that middle of the country wind project if they're on the coast. The historic energy values are not a great predictor of the future, and there's certainly a scenario where more wind penetration happens in Texas and the energy pricing on the coast rises. And you could be a university in Virginia where you entered into this offsite wind transaction and the value of energy in Texas has remained soft while the cost to serve your load in Virginia has increased. And in this situation, you certainly would have wished that you'd done the solar project because the solar PPA is now in the money and it's a effective hedge, whereas the wind project is not. So this is a fairly advanced way to think about it. But okay, so if just looking at historic values isn't great, how do we make the right decision when these economic values represent future energy market pricing scenarios? We want to do the transaction. We're really committed to offsite renewables. We like it, but we just want to make the best decision. So the best methodology, and any advisor that you'd work with or developer that understands this stuff well, but specifically the advisors, what they would do is they would look at the correlation between the energy values at your campus and the different offsite renewable project locations. And then if there's a high degree of correlation, you can think that over the long term, the hedge effectiveness of an offsite renewable project will be pretty good. Whereas if there's a low degree of correlation, you can only have so much confidence in the notion that the energy markets will move in lockstep. And if you enter into a wind PPA in Texas, that market will move in the same direction as the cost to serve your campus in Virginia. What you really want to do then is forecast, a scenario analysis to say, okay, on each of these different projects, what does the future energy value look like and how is that correlated to my campus? And then you have a pretty eyes wide open approach to thinking about how things will play out in the transaction. Let's go to the next slide.
So forward looking versus historic, most people in some of these tools that are available might have looked at some of the historic in order to make the decisions. Is that
That's right?
fair?
Yeah, I mean, over the last 5 years, historic has been the name of the game, and it's really tough to forecast what the future energy markets look like. I mean, that's as tough as predicting what the stock market's going to do, if not more difficult. There's so many different factors that play into it. But what we do know is if you look historically and the energy market at the location price to serve your load versus the energy market in Texas, if they don't actually move in lockstep, then entering into an offsite renewable project from a project far away from your campus would be pretty ill-advised unless the forward analysis showed that it was still just a screaming deal and that, you know, you sign a $10 wind PPA, which would be a penny a kilowatt hour, and, you know, in 9 out of 10 scenarios, it still ends up being the best economic proposition. So I'm going to run through pretty quickly how you can do some historic correlation analysis, and then we'll look at what a forward forecast scenario analysis would look like. So let's go to the next slide. So this is 9 days in September shown across 3 charts. ERCOT is in Texas, Dominion's in Virginia. This is what you would expect the energy markets to look like. Let's go to the next slide. Cool. Okay, so what we see is the week progresses, and you can see it on the right-hand chart in particular. When ERCOT wind is cheap, the Virginia energy price is high, and if you were trying to replace your Virginia load with ERCOT wind, that would not work from an economic perspective. Let's go to the next slide. In statistics, there's a concept of a correlation coefficient, and a regression analysis can be done to look at what the pricing looks like. What you really want to do is look at how prices move over the mean. And on the left side, you see here that although the pricing appears to move uniformly, when you dig in more closely and say what's the average price or the average delta between the two of them, there's actually a pretty high degree of variance in how it moves. And let's go to the next slide. This bears out in the correlation coefficient. Great. And you can see here that, you know, generally we go for a correlation coefficient north of 0.8 or 0.9 for a project to have a good hedge value in the future. This, you know, in the 0.1 range shows that this would not perform well as an offsite hedge. So let's go on to the next slide. What we just did with this backward-looking correlation analysis is say, historically, do Texas and Virginia move in lockstep? The answer is no. Looking forward as step 2 here, we know that it's not going to perform very well as a hedge because the pricing doesn't move in lockstep. But what are the different scenarios and how should we probability weight these? Let's go to the next slide. And the scenario analysis would certainly be more robust than just 2 future scenarios. For simplicity and time's sake, we built out 2 future scenarios here. Great. So here's the scenario. Base case scenario in the top left-hand corner. The cost for electricity supply is $33 a megawatt hour for your Virginia campus. And you see that, So under scenario 1, the cost to serve your facilities in Virginia reduces 8 years out from now. And in that scenario, your $37 PPA is out of the money, but so too is the cost to serve your load. Scenario 2, the cost to serve the load in Virginia goes up and your PPA, your solar, offsite solar, is in the money. So in the situation where you sign up with a project in your region and the wholesale market softens, you're out of the money, but half of the cost to serve your load is reduced as well. If electricity prices go up, you have to pay more for the amount that's not with the renewable project, but you have a hedge because the offsite renewable project is in the money in a notable way. If you're in Virginia and you sign up with an ERCOT Wind PPA, you really don't know how Texas energy market is going to perform relative to Virginia in the future. And in a scenario where the cost to serve your load goes down in 2025, the wind PPA could be in the money or it could be out of the money. In a scenario where the cost to serve your load goes up, the wind PPA could be in your money or out of the money. So let's go to the next slide and wrap it up here. So this is really the takeaway, and I'm sorry that we rushed through this second bit so quickly. There's really an opportunity to work in a more one-on-one fashion, but historically the prevailing thought that the highest value project was based upon the renewable power purchase agreement price versus the historic energy values. But there's a lot of these offsite deals that have turned out to be out of the money. The reason is sort of twofold. One, it's difficult to forecast energy pricing, and the energy markets have softened over the last 5 years. And two, entities have contracted with projects that are very far away from them. So to pick up the hedge benefits, the location really matters. And then secondly, a scenario analysis to look at, if this happens to my local energy market, what happens to the renewable project? If this happens to the local energy market, but I contract with a renewable project far away, what are the different scenarios that could play out? I think we got one last slide here.
And just to quickly, while it's changing, Mike, when you say far away, there also are these grids are pretty big. And so the comparison with Texas and Virginia is one thing, but what about like East Coast? This is all part of what a robust analysis would do, is to make some of these comparisons. And I think one of the points is don't assume because they happen to be, natural gas might be a driver of many energy markets, that is the case for wherever your offsite project is.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I mean, generally, if a project close to your campus pencils, that's going to provide the greatest hedge benefits. As you get further away, the markets don't move as much in lockstep, and these offsite transactions are really put in place to try and save money and reduce greenhouse gases. And the way that you save money is by entering into a transaction that if in the future energy prices rise or they stay the same, that your project performs as it's intended. And this is fairly new stuff. I mean, I'm bringing out a lot of concepts here. And what I would say is that the thought development over this is probably 3, 4, 5 years old, maybe less. And if this is overwhelming, certainly don't be concerned about that, because there are tools that are being built and the methodology is very solid. And there are projects in many different markets that would be very interested in, having an opportunity to deliver electricity to your campus. It's just finding the one that makes the most sense in a robust economic analysis.
Great. And this scenario forecasting is really important. Well, so that really wraps it up on time. And I know that last section got deep and quick, and apologies for the slide transitions. We probably could have picked up a few minutes in there if it wouldn't have taken a while to switch between. But I think maybe instead of taking questions now, because we are out of time, there's an email address at the bottom, commitments@secondnature. We'll do a follow-up survey as well with attendees on the call, and share the deck. Actually have follow-up contact information for Mike, and I don't know that I'm that helpful, but other contacts if you'd like to go deeper into this stuff. We appreciate everyone's time here. I know it's kind of getting near the holiday time. Mike, I really appreciate you putting this together, and helping us think through for ourselves how we can deliver this technical resource for signatories. And I know we're looking forward to continuing on doing this technical assistance for folks in the future. So thanks everybody for attending. Thanks, Mike, for all your great work, and we'll be in touch soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for everybody's time.